Welcome to the Megablast podcast, hosted by Montreal's Jason McDonald and brought to you by Arts and Opinion at www.artsandopinion.com.
I'm here with Tanya Maria. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So the purpose of this podcast is to discuss ideas of freedom and libertarianism, as well as how they relate to the political environment, both in Quebec and in Canada. It's going to be somewhat narrowly focused and political. It may not age well, but I wanted to get it onto the record. So why don't we start by you were telling me on the phone about this test, and you sent me the test. I didn't actually take it, but that situates people in terms of their not left-right, but just how they feel about the role of the state versus the role of the individual. Maybe you could describe that.
Oh, the political compass
Yes,
test.
yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. I stumbled upon that some years ago, and it was just an interesting little exercise to get some of my friends to take it as well, because it sort of turns upside down, or it did for me anyway, a lot of the assumptions that I had about the kind of people I get along with, right? And because of the way that they divide things up, so it's not just left wing, right wing, it's also, there are a lot of questions that determine if you're more authoritarian or libertarian. And that was like really eye-opening for me, because it made sense finally, like how come my oldest friend is like NDP voter, you know, like he's so left-wing, like, and we've gotten along for it's almost 30 years. Why is that? Because I think we meet in that libertarian space, you know. It's just like in his case, I think if you're more left-wing libertarian, you maybe have more distrust for big corporations and look at things that way. And if you're more right-wing, I think you have more distrust over government. But in general, we kind of just want to be left alone, and we agree on a lot of key things, actually, and I find that just really interesting. And the last couple of years made that really clear for me. I don't think the debate really is left versus right anymore. I really think it's authoritarian versus libertarian. And I've had like the arguments that I've had online with, you know, fellow so-called conservatives of just about the truckers. Like it was really fascinating to see that, and that's playing out in the leadership race too, right? Like
yeah. So just to drill down a little bit there, it's sort of about your values as to how you would view an individual facing systems of power.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way to characterize it?
Yeah.
And some people would be more trusting of large, you know, institutional power structures. You mentioned corporations and also governments. Just on a side note there, I've always been a little bit confused by people who get too exercised about corporations, because unless corporations work with governments, they can't really force me to do anything. Right? Walmart can't force me to shop at their store. Right?
That's true.
Whereas the government can. That's what a government technically is. It's a monopoly force. So I'm curious, do you know what your NDP friend would say to that? Just if you were to say, well, you know, government can put me in prison, but Walmart can't, you know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those funny things. Like maybe even just a sensibility. I don't know if it's even ideological, right? Like it's almost like an instinct that people sort of have of like who they mostly distrust, and like he listens to the CBC. He believes all kinds of funny stuff. We've had really funny conversations the last couple of years. Always very accepting, but frequently
great.
Not at all on the same page.
I love hearing a story like that, because I recently was mentioning these arguments online. I try very carefully to be as polite as I can be, and never to be, if someone has an obviously different opinion from mine, I try not to use that, and I confess that I don't always succeed. But recently, and I took pride for a long time there's a film professor here in Montreal. You may know Matt Hayes. Yeah. And anyway, I sort of known him through circles of friends going back to the 1990s. I don't know him all that well, but we were friends online. He's very, very left-wing. So we would he was always seemed to be, he would sort of accuse me of being a right-wing hater and everything and a conservative, and we would kind of argue a little bit. But I always thought it was respectful. And then the other day I noticed he blocked me. And I was like, yeah, no. And I don't even know why. And so I was thinking, this is, so anyway, I just wanted to say, I love hearing a story like that because I think, I want to have these real conversations with people and I don't want to exclude people from them. So I find it very disappointing when there's this sort of polarization. People don't even want to talk with the other side anymore. If you wanted
It's been so intense, though. The last couple of years have been so intense. The division is like outrageous, and all of the demonizing of people who aren't just jumping in, on the bandwagon for whatever it was. That
what's
mandatory
driving
masks was, I think, was like the first big thing.
Yeah.
And
so COVID-19 seems to be something that really split people.
I thought Donald Trump was divisive. Like among Canadian conservatives. Don't go there. Don't bring him up. That's very right there. You can argue. Yeah. Islam, immigration. Don't go there. Yeah. Don't talk about it. Because it's just so divisive and like it gets ugly. You find ugliness in people when you go down there. But I thought like that was bad, and there were like certain topics that I would just avoid.
And then coronavirus
ugliness, and then all of this, and because there's like, they sure did a good job of appealing to, Judeo-Christian ethics and love of others, and you got to take care of each other. The people who locked us down,
right. Okay, the pro-lockdown
that we had to. Right. And all of the measures, all of the mandates and everything was all like based on this appeal.
Your fellow man.
And if you disagree, you're so selfish. And you're so like, there's something like very, very wrong. And they did that very quickly too. Especially in Quebec. Like it was intense.
Minute ago government, really.
Yeah. Well, and the media here too, like I saw that early on. All of a sudden, I would see words like freedom put in quotation marks.
Yeah, that's weird.
People with your freedom.
Yeah.
How dare you talk about that? How dare you be concerned about that?
As though it's selfish in order to think about individual freedom. You're somehow placing yourself in such a way that you would not care that you're killing grandma or something like that.
There was always, that was always implied.
Yeah, I found this too with because most of my family is more on the sort of pro-lockdown side. A lot of my family members, and I was having an argument with someone in my family some months ago, and it was about the truckers actually, and the person was saying, freedom from what? From what? In this sort of exasperated tone. And I said, do you want me to answer that question? I could. So I could go through a list of about 20 things if you want me to, And so it's kind of like, it really does get back to the thing you mentioned earlier about the concern about some people are just more comfortable with an authoritarian, a state coming in and ordering around in the name of security, right? Because the theory is that the government orders us and, to wear masks or stay home and all that, and that makes us secure from the virus. And, there's a very long discussion about whether it works or not is a separate thing, but that was the theory proposed, right? And some people were more comfortable with that, and those of us on our side were less. So,
well, I mean, look at the difference. It's a difference in cultures too, eh? Like between Quebec and Alberta, right? Like, look at Kenny was a liar, and I don't think he deserved to stay on. Like, good, he's down. I don't have any mercy and sympathy for him because he lied to people, and he did put in a QR code and all that stuff. He just lied, but he had a far huger libertarian base that was up his butt for all of that the whole time, and look at what happened to him as a consequence. Whereas here, it's like you see the ultimate end, I guess, of a nanny state where the majority of the population literally expects the government to keep them safe from death.
Yeah,
like that's insane. The government cannot keep you. If they
from
can't
the risk of death,
that you're going to be awake tomorrow. They can't. It's totally actually insane. Like, save us.
Yeah,
from a cold.
That's a really, really interesting point. That's how I've felt that we've sort of reached this point where, they talk about. I hate these terms, but sort of the snowflake type stuff. But just this idea that people are terrified of. people don't send their kids out to play in the streets and all this kind of stuff. So it's almost like we've got to this point where, there's this flu that's somewhat dangerous. You can make a case it's dangerous, but it's not that dangerous, especially to young people. And it's like it became fairly clear. And yet you're right. There's this sort of panic about and you're right. The government can't guarantee anything to me or you, right? In some senses. I just wanted to make a comment about Quebec and Alberta. It seems like there's a division. Albertans tend to be very much more on the libertarian kind of I don't know, the less collectively oriented, let's say. French Canadians in Quebec, I think, have a sense of communitarianism that's very, very deep. And it's not a bad thing in other respects. There can be collective ideas that but Quebec and Alberta too also can be unified together politically and culturally by their view of the Canadian Federation.
Yes.
Right. This is an interesting thing compared to Ontario, which is very much more. Ontarians tend to be more in favor of a centralized federal.
Because it profits them.
Right. Is that what it is? I've never. Yeah.
Our confederation really is like it's been what they call the Laurentian elites, but like chunks of people
Montreal,
in Quebec,
Toronto, Ottawa,
and in Ontario that treat every other province as a colony. Yeah. That's what it's all been about, right? And you have your resentments,
that seem to go back hundreds of years at this point. If you think about Western alienation, we've got Justin Trudeau, and now we've got this, this incarnation. But his father was also, we could go back to the 70s and find people in Alberta who, for the taxes, it's a long story there, but Yeah, okay. All right, so why don't we move to that sort of covers the values issues. Let's get into some of these things about the Conservative Party in particular. I should be clear to you and my listeners that I've never been partisan towards any political party, federally or provincially, although I'm a federalist I believe in the Canadian Federation, although I have a very strong Quebec orientation to my view of the country. But I come from a very sort of left-leaning background, and my family my parents were old school left-leaning hippie types, and they loved René Lévesque and Pierre Trudeau, and so my personal values have split over the past, say, 10 years into me being less, as you were describing earlier, the libertarian, and them being more on the sort of state orientation. But I've never been comfortable with calling myself a conservative. So I just wanted to let you know that before we got into discussing the political aspects. But the Conservative Party of Canada, what is its role at this point, do you think?
Tell me.
Yeah.
They're figuring it out now, I think. This leadership race is going to tell you a lot.
So you think it depends who the...
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Because it's really continuing an argument, I guess, that started after Harper quit. Like, he built this coalition, right?
What coalition do you mean exactly?
From, let's say, you'd have your fiscal conservatives, your libertarians, your red Tories, and your social conservatives, let's say.
Right.
And among the social conservatives, let's say you put the gun lobby kind of in there, but not really. Mm-hmm. But, he managed, West and East, and he managed to pull it off.
That's interesting.
And govern for 9 years. And then he quit, and all of a sudden, there's like all of these fractures, right? And that were never really healed. A big part of it being what happened with Scheer and Bernier, and Scheer winning by such a small number, and Bernier quitting, and he was really within the new iteration, like Harper's Conservative Party was, I think, the strongest voice for libertarian ideas in a generation within a political, like a mainstream political party. I do think so, and that really hurt. And it's interesting. I mean, now. There was a poll, I forget who it was, not too long ago, that suggested that if Poilievre were to win the leadership, he would get a lot of votes back from the PPC in Bernier. There's a lot of people that would vote.
That makes sense.
Maybe not rejoin, but would vote.
Who would vote?
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. It sounds like when I hear Podiev talking, it's very much, I don't know how much he's actually almost cutting and pasting, but I don't mean that as an insult to him. I think it's good, but just that makes sense to me, basically. But this is interesting what you're saying. So the Harper's Conservative Party was a kind of a coalition of different, you know, I suppose you had Albertan kind of, you could call them very conservative type religious people, and then people in Quebec who are sort of center right but not religious, and then you've got. I read when he was elected that the Conservative Party went around in the suburbs of Toronto to ethnic voters, like Indians and Chinese, and knocked on doors and just very quietly did this. Right, it's almost stealth move. Do you know what the Liberal Party wants to do with this social issue? Like transgender, blah blah blah. And they go, really, because it's the Liberal Party seems to have a kind of not a monopoly, but they're associated with pro-immigration, which maybe they are a little more pro-immigration. They tend to be. So I think it's almost like a sense of like immigrants get the sense, well, I came to this country, I should be thankful. I should return that in some way. Who should I thank? Let's say when I'm voting. And I don't think that means that I'm not suggesting at all that immigrants are stupid or anything, but people look around for signals, right? And but anyway, it was a very interesting move that he did.
Yeah, it sure was. There was a book that was published about a year or two before the 2016 election called The Big Shift with John Ibbotson. And the central thesis is that the 21st century belonged to the Conservative Party, interestingly. And he argued that it was because of the kind of immigration that we have seen in Canada, including South Asians and Chinese, who tend to be actually more naturally conservative.
Yeah.
And if you have a party that's reaching out actively on
these social issues,
that's how you can ultimately get your urban areas and get votes there. And it was very interesting. And then after Trudeau won, he was kind of teased about that. Like, man, you got that wrong, eh? But the thing is that his whole theory depended on the left remaining splintered, like with Liberal and NDP.
Right.
And he said the only way that the 20th century doesn't belong to the Conservative Party is if the left can unite.
Unify together.
And weirdly, Trudeau kind of did that by veering so far to the left from his first campaign on. That the NDP is totally irrelevant, right?
Well, there's a de facto coalition.
Yeah.
In some sense. How irrelevant are the NDP in the sense that they seem to have a voice, right? I don't understand this coalition. Do they?
It's weird. It's just
why? Because the obvious reason to ask, why would Jagmeet Singh join if he didn't have some sort of quid pro quo there?
Yeah, he must have gotten something.
Isn't he? I don't follow these things all that closely, but I'm guessing there's something. I mean, they're talking now about.
Well, what he gets is he doesn't have to run an election because they don't have any money,
right.
And they would lose. There's no need for the NDP. They would lose. They would lose more MPs. They don't have the money. They don't have the volunteers.
So it's almost like kicking the can down the road for them.
But they need to. Some of them need to be there long enough to get their pensions. Don't forget that part.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's something I hadn't thought of. I thought there were these moves towards sort of a federal dental thing or something like this.
Yeah, they wanted that and daycare, and the national daycare already seems to be problematic in Ontario. There's a lot of because you don't have to opt in. So apparently, a lot of daycare operators aren't sure what to do. They should just stay on their own, and it's probably going to be a mess.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's interesting. Those are. I just thought they were sort of things where they wouldn't necessarily have done them if they were not. The Liberals would not have done that without some sort of, input from the NDP. But I could be wrong about that.
Probably. That's probably part of the deal. Was adopting that particular policy. Sure.
So we've got a de facto. It's a de facto majority government right now. in some senses, right?
Yeah,
So
and who would have seen any of this? Like, who could have foreseen any of this a few years ago? Well, I kind of did. Because that's the day after Justin Trudeau won in 2015, I bought my first membership to the Conservative Party
is that right?
of Canada.
Yeah.
And I just started volunteering like crazy. So I kind of saw it coming. But, like, who could have pictured all of these details?
Pretty incredible,
Emergency Measures Act and all of this craziness.
Yeah.
So,
well, why don't we stick on that? I was going to talk about that later, but just the thing with Trudeau, I don't want this to turn into kind of like a fuck Trudeau thing, because as much as firstly, I don't dislike him personally. We're sitting in his riding right now, so that's one thing. And then I lived in Park Extension, which is also in his riding. We're in St. Michel right now, but. I've met him a couple of times, he was around, one time many years ago, he was out, this is Ignatieff was the least, long ago it was, and he came into a pizza parlor it was a very hot day, and he's a very sort of congenial person, he's very, he's just, if you meet him in person, he's I wouldn't imagine. I don't think he's a bad person, is what I'm trying to say. He may not be, he probably is not that qualified to be doing this job, I think is one way.
Understatement of the year.
Yeah. Jordan Peterson has famously talked about how just him running to become it was a narcissistic act, because he never would have gotten really anywhere near it if he hadn't had the Trudeau name.
For sure.
So there's that, but we can criticize some of his actions clearly without it becoming, So what do you think? Like, just in terms of the more recent things, how can we think about what happened this year with him and the Emergencies Act and all that stuff? Do you know it's a few months on. Do you know?
Well, I think they did a good job of taking advantage of a crisis that they created. I mean, he could have just gone out to meet them.
Yeah.
Or, whatever. Pick a couple of leaders and talk to them and say, okay, we understand your concerns.
Actually,
how different might it have been?
That's a great point. I mean, let's say just try and play that thought experiment. Let's say, because would that have been possible in a realistic sense if Trudeau had said, maybe I was wrong? Like, if he had just apologized for calling them deplorables, right? There's the famous thing where he, said they're misogynist and racist.
He was insane.
It was completely,
It's so weird.
It was weird.
There's a bunch of people who lost their jobs, man.
Yeah.
They got nothing left to lose. Yeah. And it was really loosely organized too. The fact that there's still people in jail is outrageous.
They're still in jail?
Yeah, Pat King and this other guy, George.
Wow. Yeah. I didn't know that. It's interesting.
Crazy.
What about the woman who was sent out back to Alberta and couldn't return to Ontario or something? What was her name?
Yeah, Tamara Lich.
Yeah.
Métis.
She's Métis?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting.
We treat people really well
in Canada. Yeah, I mean, she seemed to be under some sort of very strict conditions.
It's funky. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So but that's because she's the one, I think, who was organizing the fundraiser.
Right.
The GoFundMe.
Yeah.
We got to her because of that. I don't think anybody expected them to raise as much money as they did. And the lying really just started with that.
What do you mean?
The lying that the government has consistently done about the truckers and who they were. Mm-hmm. It's been studied. Like, we know who donated, and it was mostly Canadians, and they're trying to say it was Russians initially. Yeah.
First they said Russians, then they said Americans. The accusation was there were these big CPACs, and it was interesting because the insinuation was somehow that there were these right-wing American, Bible thumping people who wanted, to pervert the Canadian democratic structure. And then the question, why would people in Tennessee care? The Prime Minister, it didn't even make any sense in terms of an accusation, right? Yeah. Now the Russians and the Chinese are a little bit of a different thing, especially the Chinese. If you're going to think about a foreign threat, But you're saying that that's not even true, that most of the donations actually came from Canadians? Is that?
For that first one, yeah. And then, as you recall, that was shut down, and then people, they found a different Give, Send, Go. They found a different, whatchamacallit,
Like a
thing.
way of
the thing.
getting money together.
That thing.
Fundraising.
Yeah. Anyhow.
Yeah.
And then, after that, it had just exploded into something else. So who knows who donated at that point, because it became, Canada was getting international headlines. The truckers were, there were copycat movements all around the world.
Netherlands,
too,
Australia, and everything.
Yeah.
That's something I wanted to talk to you about. That's something that struck me as a very interesting thing about that particular protest, was that it fit in an international line of so-called populist movements. First you had Trump, you mentioned Trump, and then there was Brexit, or Brexit and Trump, whichever came first. I think it was Brexit, actually. But there was a long time when you read international media, up until last year, where there was this presentation, these sort of puff pieces glorifying how Canada's avoided the populist, wave all over the world. There were a number of these articles going around with Justin Trudeau and everything. And when I was reading those articles, I was sort of thinking to myself, do these people know how he barely won the last two elections and he got fewer votes than the other guy? Maybe they don't know those details. Do they understand how tenuous? He has a terrible electoral record. That was the first thing that struck me. But the other thing that struck me was, I kept thinking to myself, there's something wrong with that analysis. There's something boiling in Canada that's not being captured by the CBC. They're not seeing it because they don't want to, right? And then it kind of blew up with the truckers. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
They sure didn't see it coming. There was the first so somebody like myself has just because of the way that I built up my Facebook account in particular, was really initially just to actually promote a page for our writing association.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then I realized,
Nice.
I can't, because I hated it. But I realized you have to do it. You actually have to post, and your account has to be active so that you can invite people to like your page. It's initially all I was doing. So I joined a bunch of conservative Canadian groups here and there, and I started sending out friend requests to people who seemed vaguely intelligent, kind of thinking like me. And that's why I have a weird friend list, I think.
Interesting.
With people from across the country. And it so happened a bunch of truckers.
Okay.
It just so happened, right? So I was starting to get, look at this. They're going to organize a convoy. Cool. How cool is that? Okay. And then you saw the first trucks coming from BC, and people just sent me stuff on Messenger here, live stream this, that, and the other. And I saw it coming. So I knew it was coming. And the very first convoy was, I don't think it was CBC, I think it was CTV. I forget exactly, but they were literally saying these are truckers protesting road conditions in Vancouver. They totally misreported that initial convoy coming out of BC.
Do you know why? Were they didn't know? They had no idea.
No idea what was coming for them.
Interesting.
And then, I think once they did realize what was coming, they tried their best to ignore it until they no longer could. And then it was right in their face.
Yeah.
And who would have thought it would last as long as it did? Who would have thought it would be so peaceful?
And also inspire movements around the world.
And interestingly, that it coincided with, a continued lockdown in Quebec. So that at one point on weekends in Ottawa, about a good third of the people there were Montreal youth who were bored out of their skull and going to Ottawa to party.
Okay. Wow.
Interesting. People don't realize
that there's a reverse.
It wasn't all truckers.
No, but that's a flip from
hey,
people.
let's go to the party.
No, but people going from Montreal to Ottawa to party is a strange concept, right? You know what I mean? It's what? That's not how it's supposed to be. Something weird going on there. That's real. I didn't know that. It's very interesting how plugged in you were, because I sort of heard about it, and I was kind of the mainstream media stuff I was seeing seemed to be very like, oh, there's this little thing, and they're gonna, it's 20 guys or whatever. But I had some people like you and others who were posting these things, going, one person I know in Toronto, she put up this thing about how it was like, as she was just asking, I've heard it's as long as Manitoba is wide. She was like, is that true? Like, if it's so, that's obviously broken into pieces. So it was kind of like conflicting information, and then once it actually converged in Ottawa, it became obvious that it really was a thing, right?
Yes.
But I didn't see that coming. I didn't know that, although to be perfectly honest, it did not surprise me because, as I was saying a minute ago, I had this sense that there was something underneath the surface in this country, that there was a populist, and, the people talk about in the U.S., they talk about the deep state, which is really a term for the administrative state, which is to say the thousands of bureaucrats in the Washington area who kind of run things. In Canada, it is so much bigger in relation to size. I mean, we have an enormous administrative state for both federally and in Quebec City as well. Mm-hmm. And many of them are, they make a kind of a bet which party is more likely to be friendly to our interests, and it's the big red machine, right? I did a content analysis once from 1900 to 2000. The Liberal Party was in power for 70 of those 100 years. I did the same content analysis, Democrat Republican. It was 48 to 52, so it's almost basically exactly equal. That tells me that the Liberal Party has been the dominant party, and that the Conservative Party is sort of the one that, when the Liberals need a timeout, when they've been too corrupt and they go sit in the corner, then, right, So I just wondered, does that affect anything current? Do you think that this is going to be a temporary thing? That, like, what do you have any predictions? Would be another way,
No, I really can't say right now until we know who the leader is of the CPC,
Yeah.
It's
be able to say,
and it looks like it would be Poilievre, but you never know. You never know who bought all those memberships.
You mean for
the most recently, like, it's a record-breaking number of memberships. So the Poilievre team is claiming they sold 311,000 or whatever out of 600,000. So who bought the rest? And how's that going to play out? It's a ranked ballot. I think if he doesn't take it on the first ballot with a good percentage and a healthy victory,
then it won't be clear.
You never know. I don't think it would be Charest. I'm more worried about Brown.
Okay. Well, let's get some of the numbers up, because I read there was 300 and some odd thousand Poilievre was able to. And how many total were sold?
It's 600 something.
Okay, so about half of them. Okay.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. And I think we'll really only know in July or something like that, because they have to go through all of these memberships now.
What do they have to do exactly? Do they have to make sure they're legitimate?
The check doesn't bounce,
right.
But no, I mean, I think they have to make sure it's real people, and then anyhow, even once people get their ballots, they still have to send them back with photo ID and whatever. So like there's a whole process to make sure that the new voters are legit. But right now, I think they're just processing everything. They go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned to you before we went live, when we were on the phone last week, that some members of my family were joining. I noticed some people in my family who are totally against them. Poilievre is Hitler, basically, is their thesis. So they need to join the party to vote against him, and this seems to be a thing. So I don't know even how to situate. When I saw that going around on social media, that there are people joining the party to vote against, I kind of just had this weird, almost like a moral instinct of there's something wrong with that, even though I can't place why, because in a purely sort of just realpolitik kind of a sense, I mean, someone could do it the other way. There's a leadership race in the NDP, and there's some person you don't want to win, you could join. But there's something I can't put my finger. It just seems wrong. It does seem wrong. Yeah,
I've never done that.
It wouldn't even occur to me, because I just couldn't. I would never look at any of the candidates and think that they're Hitler. Right. And of any political party. I don't see anything like that. That's part of, I think, one of the differences, I think. But I don't know. I'm, what's interesting is it made me join. I've never joined a political party. So I was like, screw you. Okay, I'll join and I'll vote against your vote kind of thing. So I guess we'll see when that happens. Okay, well, why don't we move to the Conservative Party of Quebec?
Okay.
This is an interesting thing. You've been sending me some really interesting stuff. There's Eric Duhaime, the leader. Can you talk a little bit about the history? It's a relatively recently reformed party. I mean, is it?
Yeah, so the Conservative Party of Quebec was formed from the remnants of the 80Q. So there was the 80Q, you remember?
Action Démocratique.
Yeah.
Dumont was the man's name, right?
And it was kind of center-right. He's such a joke now. Boy, see, talk about what authoritarian does to a human soul. Like, he's gross. Yucky, gross.
Isn't he
Isn't
he a writer for a newspaper and has a television thing or something?
So,
but I haven't been following him.
I can't watch anyway.
Yeah. But can you just describe
when you grody? But anyhow, so 80Q. So basically, there were majority of 80Q members agreed to form the CAC. Okay. And then there was like sort of a rump left of the original membership that said, no, we don't want to be doing this. We want to be conservative. And so the new Conservative Party of Quebec was formed. I forget the year, but it was very small. And like so I joined the Conservative Party of Canada, and then after a couple of years, of volunteering, just realized that there are really not very many conservative voters on the island of Montreal, are there? So it became my goal after that to try to reestablish a conservative grassroots in Montreal. Okay. And because there aren't enough volunteers, so you kind of have to overlap. You have to cross-pollinate. So I volunteered to elect conservatives federally, provincially, and municipally most recently. Right. Trying. It's really, and you're banging your head against a red brick wall in this city. You really are. But yeah, so I figured that was the only way to go. It was the only way to go. And so in 2018, because there was a provincial election coming up, I joined the PCQ, and I got to know a lot of cool people, and there was some overlap with like some federalist friends here in the island. But like what it was at the time, and with all due respect to the fine people in that very small party, but it was like a libertarian debating club, kind of. Like it was very fun, some interesting policies, especially like on
but it's
welfare.
Never going to go anywhere.
They wanted to pay welfare recipients with Bitcoin and kinds of neato stuff that wasn't going to.
There's something I never would have thought of.
Anywhere. Yeah. But like really fine people. But it was just like very, very small and
not going anywhere.
So the goal in 2018 really was to try to run candidates in as many ridings as possible. Like the goal was 125. And to try to get the vote subsidy, because in Quebec you still have a subsidy for vote. Okay. And they did very well and brought like a bunch of money into the coffers. And then, so that was like kind of exciting. Didn't elect anybody, but like there was some movement. Yeah. And the leader did fairly well. Adrien Pouliot, he did, I remember listening to him on CJD and thinking, his English was really good, and he was reaching out to people, and it's all very nice, but like they didn't elect anybody anyway. And then the lockdowns. Right. And then just so happens Eric Duhaime steps forward and says, okay, I'll run this show. And like, who would have expected any of this to happen? Like the number of members is insane. Like I think they've surpassed the CAC, and in fundraising too.
Is that right?
Yeah. There's people joining, and people going out to see him. He's drawing crowds, and like there's so much enthusiasm for this. So there must be some kind of appetite for liberty in this province after all. And he's so
that doesn't surprise me.
To watch.
Yeah, no, I was first asked about him by a former student of mine who's a friend of mine who he is kind of a libertarian type, younger guy. And he asked me about what do you think of Duhaime, and I was kind of like, who's that? Like, And then I went and looked him up. Oh, that still looks sort of. This is a couple months ago, and then you mentioned him. So there might be something there. I asked you this on the phone. I don't know whether you want to talk about it. How much do we know? It looks. How much of it is real? How much of it is just us with our, echo chamber, right? I mean, because Christian Gravener was saying that you said that maybe there'd be seats elected in this coming election.
There's hope. They're polling second around Quebec. Like it's
polling second.
Hope. Yeah.
Polling second.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Interesting. Boy, that's.
You never know, man.
So what is it? So what is it? Is it Bill 96? Because I wanted to get to that, but is that what it is?
Well, I think Bill 96 is the reason why Duhaime is getting attention in Montreal, but that's not the reason why he's polling second around Quebec City.
Lockdowns.
Like I think,
lockdowns.
Definitely,
Yeah.
I think so.
So the lockdown. So this is interesting. So the lockdown. Maybe François Legault and Justin Trudeau overstretched themselves on that. They pushed too far, and this is maybe we're going to see a reaction.
I think that's what we're looking at. Yeah. But I mean, I actually have more hope for Duhaime than I do for Poilievre, because I think federally the mess, like the debt and everything, I wouldn't want to win that. Would you want to win that? You want to take over from Justin Trudeau and fix this horrific mess?
God, the debt.
Would you want that?
Yeah, that's a terrifying job. I don't. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I never thought of it like that. Would I want to do that job? Yeah, I mean, it looks like, I mean, it's hard to explain to people outside of Quebec the relationship. The Liberal Party has a specific role, which is basically, if you vote for the other guy, we're going to end up in a new country, right? That's been their pitch for 50 years. And then the CAQ actually broke that in 2018, interestingly. For the first time in 50 years, a party other than the Parti Québécois. I mean, my impression when he's trying to chart a middle ground on Bill 96. He's trying to chart something where, it's going down the middle, aiming at centrist voters, really. Because I think the Bill 96 is somewhat of an extreme law, if I understand it correctly. I don't know if you want to talk about that. Your personal views on that, the 96?
Well, it's gonna give OQLF officers more search and seizure powers than cops do with the warrant. It's crazy. I don't know how many articles of our Charter of Rights does it violate. Does it violate? It's 28 or something. It's like this, that they have to use the notwithstanding clause to get it through. I mean, anybody, I don't think Duhaime has a choice other than to attack Bill 96, but if only on grounds of individual liberty, because he wouldn't be logically consistent if he screamed about, the government having power to tell you who you can have in your home versus the government being able to come into a business and seize your phone and your computer.
So if you're in favor of freedom, you have to be in favor of freedom.
I think so. Right. I don't think you could do otherwise.
Because I have to say, like, the 96 thing I've tried to avoid, because there's so many people in our community who are sort of they would get up in arms about anything the CAQ would do about language. So I'm kind of keeping my distance. Because some of the things I read that, the Bill 96 is going to make it that in the English language colleges, this is a stepping stone between secondary school and university, unique to the province of Quebec. You go there from about 17 to 19. I'm a professor in one of them. But in the English language one, you would do, I think, 3 courses other than your French courses. So you would choose, say, biology or history. You do them in French out of a 2 or a 3-year program. So out of, 100 courses you're going to take or something. And I kind of looked at that and I thought, people are freaking out about this and how, and I heard yesterday from a friend that, a lot of people are going to fail. And I thought to myself, if you can grow up in Quebec in the 21st century and not speak French well enough to be able to do a course in French and just get 60, pass it, then there's something wrong with the education system.
But there is something wrong with the education system. We have the highest high school dropout rate in the country among francophones. Yeah. They're not even teaching French well to their own people, let alone in English school boards. I mean, I've got a kid in the English school board, and I thought, I heard high praise, and she's not really pronouncing things very well.
Right,
You
right,
know?
yeah.
Like,
Well,
and we're counting on the school to teach the kid French, and yeah,
how
so
good
far,
is you have a daughter? How good
yeah.
is her French? Do you think? Do you think she would be able to pass one of those classes? For example, if she went to Dawson and did history or something, or
Well, that's
biology.
what the school is promising us.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Is
That,
it immersion?
eventually, yeah.
It's immersion.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But
Yeah.
but no, I mean, she last year, for example, her math mark was quite low, and we realized it's because it's taught, that subject that year was taught in French, and they were doing word
Interesting.
problems and stuff, and the teacher wasn't translating the word problems. My kid is really good at math,
Mm,
but her mark went
interesting.
down because she was
Yeah.
struggling with the French. So I don't know what to say. Like, I need the school for that,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And so far, not really sure that the kids are actually adequately prepared.
That's a problem. You see, that's the real root problem that the people are not talking about, right? That there's a problem with the education system at the lower levels. As to the dropout rates, it is true that Quebec has a very, very high dropout. I think it's the highest in North America, which is somewhat surprising because you finish school when you're 16. So that, when people drop out, yeah, which is kind of weird. But it also has a very high drop-in rate because of the system of CEGEPs when you go to CEGEP, you're in, it's like a college. So you have class once a week. You have this class you do once a week, and then it's more like a university. So that means that students can drop out of secondary school and go work at a gas station and then go, oh, I need an education. They go back. And I see this as an educator. My classes some of them are 17, some are 25. I have even some immigrants who are like in their 40s, which is a really cool thing. And so education, I don't think is that bad. I think it could be a lot worse.
It could be worse, but I mean, just in terms of the way the language is being taught, they're failing to teach the language. And my husband is a great example of that. Like, he's got his 2 French-Canadian grandfathers. He was born in Montreal, but like his dad got a job for Ontario Hydro, and when he was small, they moved to Ontario, and he didn't really, And then coming back to Montreal with all of his French cousins and all that he was in his teens, and he really struggled a lot because he didn't have the language, and there's nothing for him. Like, I've seen him try, so much like self-improvement, and like the amount of money that he spent on language courses.
Interesting.
And they do not, there's nothing for people who were born in Canada, but like, here I'm bringing up a divisive subject, but
no, go ahead.
You can walk across the border into Quebec, and through that famous crossing there.
Oh yeah.
And
that's a reference to.
They will get French lessons, but if you're born here and you're struggling a bit and you want to improve your spoken or written French, you have to pay out of pocket, and it's totally inconsistent.
Or you have to be on welfare. You have to be on
to get language.
Yeah. Because years ago, I remember going and asking them, because my French is very fluent now, but like 30 years ago it wasn't, and I wanted to improve it, and I went to them at one of these francisation places and said, I'd like to join. They said, are you on welfare? And I said, no. They said, are you a recent immigrant? I said, no. They said, well, you can't, do it. So I went and got welfare, which seems like a weird
to take French.
Yeah. Wow. It's because I wanted to. I was young, and I wasn't doing much with my life anyway. I was kind of, I had just finished university, and I was kind of, drifting around. So I thought,
next step.
Yeah. So I thought I might as well, jump on welfare. But I mean, I mean, I don't know that. I've thought a lot about this from a libertarian perspective. The way we do it now, immigrants come in and they don't pay. Those courses are effectively free. You pay a very nominal fee. Also for English, my wife doesn't speak English, and she wants to go over here to the John Kennedy School in Saint Michel to do English, and they have the equivalent thing. And we went over there to enroll her, and they had like full on 4 days a week, 4 hours a night of instruction. That's really intensive. $100 for the whole session.
Wow.
Which is what she paid in Park Extension at William Hingston to do the French originally, which is, and in theory, I could go and do that. I could just go, or you could, not that we would need it, but a Canadian could. You have to be a citizen. But Just back to the Bill 96, so those things about, people taking, going into Cégep and having to do courses in French, I'm not so sure I'm totally opposed to those, just from a perspective of, if I take the view that a Quebecer, like if we all can be proud to be Quebecers, and one of the things we should be proud of is the French language. Like, it's something that defines us and everything, even if you're an Anglophone, right? Right? I mean, if you're an Anglophone, you should be able to speak it well. And also, in my view, it should be something where you can say, you know what, Quebec is cool because of that. And I'm really, and so that sort of fits in with that. But the things you mentioned about the searching and seizure, just to be clear, listeners understand what that means. That means that if a person is working for a company, and they feel that let's say they think there's something going on in the company that's against the language policies, maybe the internal emails or something are being conducted in a language other than French, if it's more than 50 employees or something.
25 now.
25, so they've lowered it. Okay, interesting. They can go and make what I believe is an anonymous complaint. They don't even have to reveal their identity, and they can just name the company, and then the police, or not the police, the Office de la langue française, or Office québécois de la langue française, I think is the technical name now. They can come to the company and seize things like that have the documents in question without any probable cause or search warrants. Do I have that right?
Essentially.
That to me is all of my sympathy for nationalists and Quebec and everything is just completely washed away by that one thing. I could not be in favor of that law.
Yeah.
Under that. That's utterly, it's just so beyond the pale in terms of individual freedoms. There's no way I could support it.
And then there's the healthcare stuff. Like the whole, so this is the funny thing. So I take care of my mom. She's 87. She's an immigrant. And because she was a stay-at-home mom, it just so happened that she never really learned French well. Okay.
That's the era
now,
she came here, right? Yeah. She came here some time ago, back in the 50s when English dominated. Yeah, so people learned English, right?
And my father's French was gorgeous. My father was trilingual. He spoke, at one point, his French was better than his English because he worked in,
Interesting.
Anyway, she didn't go to school here, so she doesn't have her English eligibility.
What country did she immigrate?
Both of my parents were born in Germany.
Germany, okay, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So she spoke German, obviously, and she immigrated here, and she learned English more than...
She came here as a nanny, because she liked reading, she joined the Doubleday Book Club. She taught herself English by reading novels and stuff like that.
Wow. Okay.
Anyway, so she wasn't educated here. She's not a historic Anglophone, even though she's been a Quebecer for like 65 years or whatever. But she's not a historic Anglophone, but I am. So how?
Because you went to school. Because you went to school in English, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. In Canada,
So how bizarre is that occasionally, I might have a telemedicine appointment with her doctor, and I've just been trying to picture this because my mom has dementia. So it's really me talking to the doctor, right? In the last couple of years with COVID and everything, it's been phone calls. So I'm trying to picture, if we were to follow the letter of the law, my mother is the patient, the doctor should be speaking in French.
Mm-hmm. But
I'm the kid. Do I have to? Am I supposed to fax her my high school? My. Do
you know? Have you inquired
into
this?
My diplomas
to show that you actually
to be allowed to have. No, I haven't inquired into it because it's insane.
Interesting.
It's insane.
Yeah. So just so we try and explain this to anyone listening, as I understand the law, a person who goes to a doctor and wants to get the service from that doctor in a language other than French, in English, I believe specifically, right? Because it wouldn't be another language, like Spanish or something. It would be English. You have to be, historic Anglophone is a polite way of saying de souche, right? So basically means more or less it's a person who was educated in English in Canada, so they have some sort of historic link to the Anglophone community, let's say. So if a person came, a friend of mine has a friend whose his girlfriend is from Japan, and this is an Anglophone, and they live in or someplace, and they speak English together, and she doesn't speak French. So I'm presuming if she went to the doctor, she would be refused under this, right?
Well,
Is that how it's...
apparently, or like the
Right.
doctors and the nurses and everybody is just expected to only speak in French unless this is where you start to wonder, like, what if you're in an emergency? Are they really going to be asking for your papieren, bitte, your papers in emergency
Yeah.
to prove that? And it's your health.
Yeah.
And like
Boy.
when you wind up in a hospital, I mean, like, you tend to be in a crisis situation. I don't know about you, but I tend to go back to my first language, eh?
Yeah.
Like, you know, if you're very emotional or whatever, you know, like, I don't argue as well in French as I do in English,
Yeah,
right?
that's interesting.
And you're in a crisis situation. And what about all the immigrants who don't speak either one? Are you expecting, like, you know, I've worked in a hospital, eh? I used to work at the Jewish
Really?
General as a nurse's aide for years, and you would regularly hear almost every night on the intercom, would someone speaking, you know, whatever Pashtun, whatever language, that was like every night in some other different language, please come to emergency, because we needed anybody, like if it was a visiting family member or whatever, to go and translate for a patient in emergency, usually.
So is that going to be abrogated?
Well, you gotta wonder, like, how crazy is that? And should that be the first thought of any healthcare worker going into a room, and the patient doesn't, you can tell they don't speak English or French, and you're supposed to just say parle en français instead of trying to communicate? Like, you know, I learned how to say hello in many languages. I learned, like, you use sign language. You have to communicate with people. You shouldn't be having that in your head. Like, am I going to get punished?
Well, I suppose we could divide it from just, you know, the emergencies from just, for example, your mother consulting the doctor when she just has an appointment. That's not an emergency necessarily.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that should be in French, but just that would be something where I'm not sure if the law makes that distinction. It might not.
No, it's your health. You should be able to understand what's being said to you. And there should be, like, you know, like, it's just like, this is policy that's crafted by people who can't possibly live in Montreal, right? And isn't that a big problem with the CAQ? Because their base is not here. They don't have to care about Montrealers. They really don't. The city is the creation of the province. They can do whatever they want with this city, with all of the cities. That's like just the way that this province is run. They can do what they like. They don't care.
My impression of it is, of just from a sort of stepping back and overview, is that the CAQ has replaced the Parti Québécois of being the party that represents the people outside of the Montreal area. Right? When I was younger, it was always when the PQ was in power, it was very, very same dynamic of people here in the city being very suspicious of it. Except in those days, there was a separatist thing that was part of it. But the CAQ, and in recent weeks, months, many of my fellow Anglophones have been making the claim that François Legault is in fact a separatist. And I don't know how to think about that, because I don't know what that means. Is he some sort of secret plan? It's very, very sort of conspiratorial to me. You probably heard this, right?
Well, I mean, he's a former separatist.
Like, he was a pickist,
and he is a nationalist. Like, he's pretty clearly, you can see who he's trying to appeal to. But if he's a secret separatist, I don't know.
I've heard people saying this.
Really?
I've had friends who say this. Yeah, that he's sort of secret. That this Bill 96 is part of sort of a longer term plan. I don't really know how to think about that. I'm not sure how to situate that, but I did want to think about this concept of getting services in the language that you desire. So I just had a little anecdote about that. Some friends of ours are from Argentina. My wife is a Latina, so we're very connected, and we have friends that she works for at a daycare. And this woman, she goes to get vitamin injections you can get. And for reasons that are too complicated for me to understand, these vitamin C injections were not allowed in Quebec. I'm not sure if it was the Collège des Médecins du Québec or if it was Santé Québec or something. It was just not allowed. So she was going to Ottawa and then more recently she found a place in Cornwall, Ontario, which is closer, so she would go. And recently I drove her. Her husband couldn't take her, so I took her. So we were talking, and she doesn't speak English. She speaks Spanish, obviously, and French with some. So we were driving there, and she told me that when she went to Ottawa, the people there were super nice. They served her in French, didn't no worries at all. In fact, I think they may have been French Canadians, the nurses. She told me an interesting story when she went to Cornwall. She went into the clinic the first time, and the woman served her in French and was kind. And I asked if it was a French Canadian. She said, no, I think it was an Anglophone. She spoke with an accent. And then she went back again a month later to do the treatment again, and the same woman indignantly refused to speak to her in French, which was interesting, right?
It's weird.
It is weird, isn't it? And I was sort of scratching my head, thinking, why would this be? And then it struck me a few days later, it could be, because this was recently, that the woman was following the news, and Cornwall's close to Quebec, and thinking, our people in Quebec, the Anglophones are being put upon. So why, screw anyone. Even though the person coming through the door has a heavy Spanish accent, it's still somebody from Quebec, and they're speaking French, right? So you can kind of take it out on them. I don't know if that is
it
true.
Could very well
yeah,
be. I'm sure, but and that's what's so gross about language wars, isn't it? It gets stupid. Did you hear about the brioche incident in Westmount?
No.
So, this made quite a number of papers. There's just some coffee shop in Westmount that's owned by a French guy from France who was the subject of an email that got widely circulated, written by an offended Anglophone customer because she felt that he was doing too much of the parle en français thing, and he ended up having to defend himself, and it was like really mountain out of molehill, but like this kind of thing.
This is in Westmount?
Yeah.
It's an odd
place. Just a woman
place.
going in, and I think she was upset because he asked her if he wanted her brioche chauffée. He said chauffée.
And she
I guess she didn't understand or whatever, and then he's like, "Mais on parle français ici."
And he's from France.
And he's from France. And he said something that rubbed her the wrong way. And like it's this big incident, and there were a bunch of Anglophones calling for his place to be boycotted.
Wow. Interesting.
This is the sort of thing I always hated. I always hated this. Going back to the 90s, I never understood how Galganoff and like you're gonna go protest for the apostrophe sign on Eaton's. Like it was a lot of energy. I never went to any of that.
No,
stuff.
neither did I. I never understood the whole anger about it, and and you're right. It is a reignition of all of those old things. Like if in fact this clinic in Cornwall is doing that. That's kind of like back in the 80s and 90s you remember when the guy in Ontario was Brockville or whatever stomped on the Quebec flag. Do you remember? This was around the Meech Lake thing, and then it just was circulated, turned into this huge thing where people in Quebec were just with reason, I think in some sense, but I mean they perhaps an overreaction. It was one guy, But yeah, I mean, all of that was going on in those days. So how many of these things are... The other thing I wanted to mention about this is that if you're an immigrant coming in here, it's all very foreign to you. Like when I was talking to my wife's boss and our friend, Ada, in the car about... I was talking about this Bill 96, and she didn't know what it was. She was like, what's this? And I said, well, there's this language law. Have you heard about this? And she said, no, I don't know. Right? Like, don't know what it is. So I explained it to her, some of the things about, and when I explained the thing about healthcare, an interesting thing where I said, if a person comes in and they're not a quote unquote historic Anglophone, then they have to be, the doctor has to speak in French. She immediately was interesting. She immediately said, that's not terrible. It kind of immediately, her sense of sort of individual dignity was, and she has no dog in this fight. Right? Yeah. This is a person from Argentina who's looking at this country. She's been here for maybe 30 years or something, but from a very different lens from the way you or I might look at it, both being embedded in the
I'm a child of immigrants, though, eh?
So am I.
I do have a weird perspective. Like it is, although I mean, I think I've just been here so long that I mean, I'm Canadian, and or whatever. Quebecer, depending on the context, right? I mean, I can just as easily call myself a Quebecer or a Montrealer, like it's part of my identity. Right. I decided to stay. I didn't follow all my friends down the 401. Yeah. So that's all I did through my 20s was going away parties. Oh, where are you going? Back? Oh, good. Got your degree? Bye. It was nice knowing you. They were all going. Really? Yeah. And I chose to stay here. I love it here. Why would I stay here if I didn't love... I think you've touched on something really interesting, that the
we went through this before with the Bill 101 and the first referendum and all that stuff, and so a lot of people who left were, I think, the first round that happened then. People who left were people who really kind of either maybe they didn't speak any French at all and they didn't want to learn it. They were very, that seemed to be a common thing. I remember talking to a guy in Toronto once, and he was like a working guy, from Montreal, and he's like a construction guy, and and I said, "Oh, you're from Montreal? You left Montreal?" He said, "Yeah, every time I go and apply for a job, they ask, do you speak French?" And I say, "No," and no, that's all. And he was sort of talking about it like it was so unfair, and I was thinking like, it's kind of like 80% of the population speaks that language, So he left. And I'm not blaming. It's just that it's. But you wonder, it's happening again now. Is this round 2? Why is it going on? I don't really understand.
Well, you don't see it as a distraction from the
Could
mismanagement of the last
Is that what you think it is?
There's an election coming up, and that's what they're going with. That and $500.
Yeah.
Did you get your go money? It's a nice way to find out someone's salary. I won't ask you, but actually, I know people who got that money and made a nice donation to the PCQ.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So you think it's just purely a just way of diverting attention away? Could be. I think so. Could well be.
Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah. I mean, I think there are enough nationalists within that government that absolutely 100% think this is the right thing to do. But yeah, it's an election year, and that's a nice way to kind of bring your base along. Like, here we go. Now this is what we're doing now.
Well, that's what these signs that I see around town, like let's say le bilan. It's kind of like bilan in French means like when you do like a report for what you've done. It's like a report card kind of word. And that seems to speak to what you're saying. They're sort of saying to the voters, look, we said we were going to deal with this, and we. Right, and so we have.
Because they're not going to talk about, the coroner's report and how they euthanized people in the old age homes, right? Like, they're not going to be talking. They're not going to be talking about people left, in their own feces.
Yeah, that's interesting. The COVID-19 madness has been. You're right. That's a real.
Well, what went on in the nursing homes, and that's actually when I really started paying attention to Eric Duhaime. So it so happened I was following him on Facebook, and there was that first spring of COVID, and we had all of these horrifying stories coming out from the nursing homes. And I read did you read the military report?
I heard about it. Can you describe some of the main findings of it?
It's really hard to read. But it was just the reports, and there was a military report for Ontario, what they found in the nursing homes there, and one for Quebec. It's publicly available. I can send it to you if you want.
And it's worse.
Read that. It's like just details of how people were found, like staff totally abandoning people, and there's horrible stories coming out of there. And who was writing about this? It was actually Eric Duhaime, and just because I was following him, I was seeing what he was writing, and he early on used the word hecatombe, les hecatombes, in the nursing homes, and he seemed to be asking a lot of questions that I didn't understand why the media wasn't asking Legault any of this stuff, like what actually happened. That was the bulk of the COVID numbers. And people died of dehydration. They were dying with COVID, but they died because they were abandoned. And we've never addressed that. This is like
that's interesting. Yeah.
They've got blood on their hands.
Yeah, that's a real
they have not addressed that.
So we saw when the COVID thing hit, many people have made this point you're making, which is that it exposed these weaknesses in the healthcare system, right? Seems to be what you're saying, especially for old age. And those numbers have never, you're right, they've never returned. That initial wave.
That was the bulk of the deaths.
Probably, I'm not sure the numbers, but from, March 2020 to, the 6 months following that was probably. Yeah, that's probably what it is. It's probably a diversionary tactic. I don't know. On the other hand, they do have somewhat, like, if I step back for just a minute and I think about the French language and the English language, I try and think I'm always trying to think when I hear the charge that English is becoming more prominent in Quebec and in Montreal. I always think, is it true? And I think, well, when my mom came here from the United Kingdom in the 1950s, clearly English was more dominant in those days, and that we were all British and everything, and all that kind of stuff. So there's that, but then there is some anecdotal evidence that English is becoming more prevalent on the island of Montreal. I don't know if I'll just give you a couple of examples. People talk about this, when the delivery guys come to my door here. I'm here, my wife is here. They're usually like Indian or Pakistani, right? They drive the Amazon trucks, or they drive and they very often speak only English, and also sometimes I will speak to them in French deliberately, and then I won't change to English just as a sort of experiment, see what they do, And and they're not rude. They're just, here's your package, they give you a package. But I've never had one of them ever say something like, I'm sorry, I don't, in English, I can't speak French. Here's your package. I haven't had time to learn. I've only been here for 6 months. And so it makes me think, like, they're not getting the memo that there's this, that for some people would be very, it's sort of offensive to me, and I'm not even a French Canadian, you know what I mean? And I think if someone were, a person worried about the French language and a French Canadian background, that would be, and I've heard Francophones say this. I've heard them say this, and so you think, is there anything there, or is that just us being closed-minded to immigrants? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure how to think about that.
I don't know the numbers,
Yeah.
but will always repeat. Let's teach the language better.
Yeah.
Let's just do a better job of teaching the language, reaching people, and giving them the opportunity to learn it, and especially if they're going through the school system. So an interesting story. They shut down the schools, right? 2 years ago, they shut down the schools. Here I am with my husband and our kid trying to figure out.
How old is your daughter?
So she's going to be 9 this year.
Okay.
So she was in grade 1. So it's the end of grade 1, and everything gets shut down. And she's in the school in the EMSB, the English Montreal School Board. So 6 weeks later, we get an email from the EMSB with some study guides. Like, there was nothing.
Yeah, for 6
right?
weeks. Wow.
There was nothing. And, it actually took a while even just to get the school books, right? Because they were all, any book that your kid had
They were
to
in
have
the
in the
school,
school were
right.
still in the school.
Because they couldn't get in the school
right?
to get them.
Yeah. And it was crushingly hard to find even the curriculum for French for that grade. Like, what are the expectations? Just so I know, what are they supposed to know for verbs, and what are the expectations? And my husband did so much research and trying to find some kind of guidance, and there was nothing that he could find from the Quebec government on how to teach your child French. Like, there was nothing. So he was using educational online resources from France because they understand how to teach French as a second language. There is no approach from the government that we could find anyway that helps parents to teach French as a second language. They don't understand the concept even of that. Like, there was nothing. We were floating around.
So let me understand this, because so you were at home for 6 weeks before anything happened.
Before we got anything from the school,
yeah.
and there's this one day where I heard my husband. He's got his office with a bolt. Okay, so there's a bolt on the door. Dad's in his office. He's working.
Right.
That's the house I live in. He's got to, because he's with 3 women. Got to bolt the door, and every so often I'll know if he's upset with something he's reading. Could be anything, because you start to hear the pounding. Doesn't happen too often, but man, that day when he got the email from the EMSB with the recommended online, help to resources. And it was like a lot of banging and some kind of screaming. So he finally comes out, and what did they send was a bunch of links to things like PBS Kids and CBC Kids, and all of this stuff that he had researched and rejected as being ridiculous, like stupid.
Yeah.
Where's the math? Like, what is the math I'm supposed to teach in grade 1 in Quebec?
So it's not.
It was a total joke. And we realized we were completely on our own.
Wow.
And that's why I think that's why grade 2 was so hard.
For your
And like I was
kid.
saying, for the math, like why did she do so poorly? It's because she was home for 6-7 months with Anglos.
Yeah.
And
then
we
so
tried, man.
right.
We really tried.
Yeah.
Like I'm telling you, he was buying books from France to teach her French.
This is something that is really interesting. First of all, I should just say that in our case, we were shut down. It was like, okay, we'll get back next week. And then after that week was up, I sent another email saying, okay, we should be back next week. And after 2 weeks, it became clear that, because I'm a teacher in the CEGEP system, and so there were frantic meetings going on between the union representatives and the administrators of the CEGEP of what to do. And there was a union, sort of an emergency union meeting, and I wasn't actually, it was a Zoom thing. And it was interesting because I wasn't there, but a colleague told me that there was a split. Some people thought that, we need to adapt and get the Zoom thing. No one knew how to use Zoom, and we were like, well, we got to start doing that. And then there was a significant group of people who were, enraged. And there was one guy who, I won't name him, but he was a person who's a teacher at my CEGEP who was indignantly claiming this is oppression to us and we need to shut the session down and just cancel the whole thing and everything. And the head of the union, Sylvie Demers, she's really, really good. She kept very quietly repeating, we are being paid. We have an obligation to finish the session. The students signed up. They signed up in their classes. We've done half of them. We have to do it, which I was completely in favor of, and I adapted onto Zoom, figured out a system. I didn't enjoy it, but just to speak to the split in attitudes of some people who I'm sort of been appalled at the lack of, like, when I hear that colleague of mine saying that, does he not care about what the students, they would just have like a lost session that they would have got? Like, is that not important to him? Does he think that we should just give the credit for half a session? Like, I don't even understand. It's so immoral. It's like, no, that's wrong. You're a teacher. It's our job. We're supposed to teach people and give them and accredit them as well. And it sounds like you bumped into 6 weeks is a very long time. We went 3 and we were back after 3.
Okay.
Because that was there was a 1 week transition period. All this took a full 3 weeks, and then we were up on Zoom. So I don't know. I've heard other horror stories from my brother lives in the U.S. and just of the unions and the teachers being completely, what's the word? Just seeming not to care that much about the,
Yeah, I'm not very impressed with the teachers' unions.
Yeah.
I'm going to be very quiet here. You're a teacher.
No. I please don't.
I haven't been very impressed with any of them.
Yeah.
Honestly, because. Like, your job is actually to take care of my kid.
Yeah.
Your job is to teach my kid, and maybe that sounds kind of mean, but
I don't
you're
think it's
more
mean.
worried. Like, you think it's okay to lock up little kids for months at a time, and there's absolutely nothing for them to do, and they can't see their friends, and you think that's like, you're doing that because you feel scared of getting a cold from a kid under your charge. Like, that shouldn't be your priority. It's so weird. What human civilization has survived?
Yeah.
That
caring less about the children. Yeah. Well, not the protection, but the development. Like what you're saying, because I agree with you, is that there was a prioritization done for the elderly at the expense of very young children. I wanted to just say something quickly about that. The effects of the lockdowns on perhaps your daughter and many other young kids, I think we're just starting to see that now. I've written an article about this that I'm going to have published on Arts and Opinion. Yeah, because what I noticed when we came back was, first of all, during the pandemics when we were doing it on Zoom, the dropout rates were through the roof. In my classes, I would have a class of 29 students or something, and 15 of them would get incompletes or something. It was just like, and then 3 more would fail. You know what I mean? It was like just incredible. And then after, what's more interesting is now that we're back in, I've noticed I've had, like, this past session, I've had several cases where students came to me and said, I'm having a panic attack. I can't stay in the class. And they would leave or they would email me. I had so many cases of, and I believe them. I don't think they're shining me on, but it tells me if you take a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old who's already a little bit socially anxious and you lock that kid up for 2 years, that kid's going to be worse at the end of the 2 years when he goes back in with a bunch of kids, right? He's going to be more anxious. And this, I find, we don't know what the effects are going to be going forward. Has this scarred an entire generation of people, or so maybe a few generations? One of our friends in Laval he has 2 daughters, and one was born during the pandemic, and so we would go over to visit, not that frequently, but during the pandemic when we would go, and the baby that was born during the pandemic would just cry and wail and scream, and it was more than anything we'd ever seen, more than the sister and everything. And Fanny said once, she said she never sees anybody. She's in the house all the time. Nobody ever comes in, so she never sees she doesn't go to daycare. You know what I mean? So the only people she ever sees are her parents and her sister, right? And then her grandfather, who's German, by the way, interestingly. But and so you wonder, has she been scarred by that? She was, she's now about 2.5 or so, 2 years old, right? I don't know how deep this is running.
I don't know. We'll find out.
Yeah, and I think the lessons as we move towards closing, I think the lesson that I would take is people who rush to do these lockdowns. I think that message should be our message. But be careful, because the next generations are important, right?
They sure are. I'm not very good at remembering numbers, but I do actually remember this. I'm just trying to remember where I read it. But apparently in Ontario, it's come out, they've studied the effects of shutting down the schools.
Oh, is that right? Really?
And how shutting down the schools actually affected COVID infection rate. And it was 0.08%.
Wow.
Something like that.
That's low.
It did
had
nothing.
no effect. Yeah.
It did nothing.
Wow.
It just destroyed a bunch of kids. And we'll find out how screwed up they really are.
Yeah. Well, I know that my brother has 3 children. He lives in California. And those schools, California is very left-leaning, blue Democrat, and the schools were closed forever.
Yeah.
They were closed for almost a full 2 years. And one of my nieces is about 15 now, and she went through a very, very difficult period of depression, and she was very depressed, and and all this, and I remember my brother and his ex-wife were just enraged, and at one point he was telling me how the teachers were like, at one point she didn't show up for the Zoom thing in the morning. The teacher sent this snippety little email like, your daughter was not in the class, and then so my brother sent me this email that his ex-wife had sent back, like basically saying, you lazy fuck, you haven't been in the class, and my daughter's depressed. I mean, she put it in a kind of a snippety way, like, and she's now depressed and sitting in her room, so it's like, it's on you that she's not coming in, basically, And so how many of these cases are, there's probably a lot of this going on.
Oh, I know, right? So many parents, we've just quietly exchanged stories here and there. I know, people who've gone through a lot with their kids, suicide attempt, and
Jesus,
14.
It's really, God.
Yeah.
I mean, these are things that, because this is, just to think about our priorities. Your mother's, you said she's 87, right? So she's an important person, obviously, to you, and, but if you had to, if you were in a lifeboat, right? This is a horrible thing to think about, and you had your daughter and your mother, obviously your daughter would be. Do you know what I mean?
My mother wouldn't have it any other way, though. So this is the thing. So
do you know what I mean? We have to think your daughter's more important because she's only 9, right?
My mom made it very easy for me. That woman lived through World War II, okay? She made it super easy for me. So when they first shut the schools down, she already was having dementia there. So, every morning you get pretty much the same story for a few weeks until she moves on to another story.
Oh, okay. Right? Yeah, right,
okay.
Right.
And so, so every day a kid would come into the kitchen and my mom look at her, why is the child not in school?
Right.
Mummy, they locked down the schools. Why would they lock down the schools? Coronavirus, Mummy. And after a couple of weeks, I don't know if I can swear on this, but it was like effing coronavirus, Mummy.
Yeah.
It was getting annoying. But she wasn't registering. It made no sense that they would shut down schools for a virus. So I would say, Mommy, it's because of coronavirus. Oh, that's insane. They're insane. And then it came out, and I have the story memorized. The last year of the war, so she was the oldest of 7, and they were in a port city in the north, so there were frequent air raid sirens, like almost every night towards the end, and they would have to run to the bomb shelter. So that last winter, they have no coal, they've got no food. They're running every night to
This is in Germany at the end of World War II, right? Yeah, wow.
And all 7 children had the whooping cough.
Okay.
And their mom had to try to suppress her 7 children coughing, and it's called whooping cough because you go every time you cough as you're taking in your breath. It's very loud, and they're not supposed to be making noise in the bomb shelter. So they were hiding under blankets night after night, coughing all winter long.
Wow. Yeah.
And then, Tanya, we had to go to school the next day, and we didn't have anything to eat. And our shoes didn't fit us well. We all had deformed feet. Apparently, that whole generation of Germans has deformed feet.
Is that right?
Getting squished into bad-fitting shoes.
Interesting.
Yeah. And we didn't have any books, Tanya. We had nothing to eat, and we were coughing all day long, and we had to memorize the lessons.
Right.
Right. And they never shut down the school in war, no matter what.
Germans wouldn't do that. Good for them.
But no humans, what human society has actually shut down their children's lives?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it occurred to me while you were talking that during the Spanish flu there were some closures.
I think so. Yeah.
But it brings up the question of how serious the disease is, and the Spanish flu was a far deadlier disease, as far as I can tell, just by the death rate, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an empirical question. How many people are dying before you say we have to shut down? And I think not enough. I don't think.
But
that.
Yeah, I mean, So that was the story I heard from my mom every day, and then and she would ask, "But why, Tanya? Why are they doing this?" And I said, "Well, Mom, it's to protect your age group."
Yeah.
And she said, "I won't have any part of that.
Yeah.
Not on me. She needs to be in school." And it really infuriated
That's touching,
her.
yeah,
And she said, "When it's my time to go, God's going to come and get me, no matter what it is." She's 87 now, so it was 2 years ago. But
So that's very touching.
Very easy.
So she's basically saying, I recognize my life is not as important as my granddaughter.
I don't know if it's a matter of importance. It's just a matter of your priorities.
Yeah, your priorities.
That's
very touching too. So you could try and imagine a parallel world where we were less crazy. What we might do is we might say, okay, we've got a person at risk, an 85-year-old woman living in a house with a young 7-year-old, right? So when the 7-year-old comes home, she just doesn't go into grandma's room. Or something, and have a wash,
She was staying. We've always done this anyway because she was always vulnerable.
Protect
my mom
grandma.
was always vulnerable anyway.
Right.
She's a cardiac condition, like any cold. So and we've been living together since my daughter was 10 months old. So I mean, we've always been careful. The shoes stay downstairs. You come in, you wash your hands right away. When she comes home from school, uniform is off. Mm-hmm. You wash your hands, and then you go and you say hi to grandma, And if she's drooling with a cold, you don't go and kiss grandma. But I had people asking me, Tanya, how do you do it? You're sending your kid to school, or what? Are you sure you're not going to pull her out of school? Because every day she's putting her grandma at risk. And people were even asking me when the school started up again in September, does your daughter wear a mask at home? Why would I do that?
Yeah, wow.
We just went, we had to go zen early on, right? And just be whatever gets us, gets us. And whatever, in the end, it's going to come into our home or it won't, and my mom will keel over or she won't.
Yeah.
But, you can't.
So there's it's not a bravery, but exactly. There's a kind of an acceptance of risk and not letting fear dominate your existence. It sounds like a case you're making, right? Man. Exactly, yeah.
We used to be chased by dinosaurs. Well, not dinosaurs.
Well,
but
whatever, woolly mammoth and lions and all that in the savannah.
Life used to be fraught with danger, and there were no guarantees. I don't understand why we think that the government owes us that. They have to keep us safe. That's even the government's job.
I like how this is, as we get towards the end, that you've brought it back to that. You brought it back to the idea that the government, it's not the government's job to keep me or you from dying, right? At least from a disease. Is that? Yeah.
I mean, we could discuss like role of government and the healthcare system and you know should there
well the
know,
reason
exclusively public delivery of services and etc. We can have that discussion, but like really, there like I think I got that impression that there were people who really thought, well, the government's they've got to do something. People are sneezing.
Yeah.
You know, and like what was
like
their one job? Was to keep the healthcare system going
and, they screwed
and
that
to
one
take
up.
care of our elders. It was their one job in a health crisis, you know, and they miserably failed. And like it's just I don't see how anything that they've done in the last couple of years has actually benefited our collective health. On the contrary, right? Like drug abuse is up.
Is it? Drug abuse? Yeah. I know that crime has been rising all over North America, including here in Montreal.
Yeah.
Violent crime has been up. So I don't know whether that's the government's fault. I don't know if there's a connection there.
Obviously, they should have taken away all the guns a long time ago, and kitchen knives should be used with
You're being facetious,
caution.
right?
Yeah. It's illegal guns. Like most of the crime committed in our streets.
Just so people don't actually think you're proposing that kitchen knives should be taken away.
But like.
Well, it's interesting because the governments, if you go back, the reason governments have arisen over our, human history of governments in the modern sense of empires and modern states is security. Mm-hmm. Is security, right? So internal security, less important than external. So the idea of having a protection from outside invasion. So it sounds a little weird. It is kind of the government's job to keep us safe to some extent. So it's not totally crazy to think if there's a crisis that the government would be where people would look, because that's what, like, let's say the country was being invaded from the outside.
Okay,
who would we look to, right? It's the question is how we do that, and also the severity of the threat. I think you and I are looking at this and trying to place the COVID threat on a threshold of how serious is that threat? Is it a threat that I should be, hiding in my basement? Is it as much of a threat as bombs coming down onto? Obviously not, right? Okay. Before we close, is there any other words of inspiration you want to tell people about you're very interested in political organizing? Anything?
Well, you should know I did quit the Conservative Party of Canada last, in anger and frustration with Aaron O'Toole's leadership last January. I really dragged my feet rejoining, in part because I wouldn't want to give $15 to any party that would consider having Jean Charest for a leader. It was really hard to drag my feet, but yeah. So I don't see myself going back really to volunteering, but that would be maybe another conversation of why. But I'm gonna pay attention to Eric Duhaime and see what I can do, just locally, just help the candidate,
I think people outside Quebec don't understand how seriously people dislike Jean Charest in Quebec. I think people in other parts of the country kind of don't really get that. And so
they remember him. They remember the throwing around his passport, in 1995. It was cute, eh? Nice he did that so long ago.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean,
what
did
he do since?
He became, Prime Minister of Quebec, and then of course he became notorious for being, at the end of his tenure, a big corruption scandal that broke out, and he was more or less chased out of power at the student strikes some years ago. So I don't really understand the Conservative Party of Canada. I think would be making a big mistake in as much as they want to make inroads in French Canada. That would be a big mistake, I think.
I don't see how he would be able to do that.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
He's hated.
That's what I'm saying.
Not by everybody, but I mean, he's hated by a lot of people. I don't see the logic in that.
So a more inspirational message might be something like the Bernier-Poilievre idea that I am a free Canadian and you're a free Canadian. We'd like to promote that idea that people, that it's good. We're part of this country. That's a good country, and we want to continue its development, and people come here because it's a free country, right? I think that's something that we could probably definitely say is an inspirational. I hope it's an inspirational
Definitely.
message to other Canadians.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope so. The
Yeah.
smallest minority on earth is the individual.
That's true. That's true. Okay, well, on that note, thank you for being a part of the Megablast podcast. I've really enjoyed this.
Me too. I had a lot of fun. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
This Megablast podcast has been brought to you by Arts and Opinion, an online journal permanently housed in the Archives of Canada. The address: www.artsandopinion.com.